In this mini lecture, we'll be discussing gender, globalization, and development. Before we get started, it's important to take a moment to unpack some of the terminology used in these areas. Sociologists make a distinction between sex and gender. Sex refers to the biological characteristics a society uses to categorize an individual as male or female. In contrast, gender refers to the characteristics a society uses to manage their sex categories. These are the cultural meanings associated with men and women's roles in society, or the cultural expectations a society has of men and women. Scholars and activists have also argued that prior to thinking about issues related to gender development and globalization, it's important to recognize traditional gender relations in any society. Gender relations are the socially constructed forms of interaction between men and women, and it's important to understand these relations prior to constructing new policy or development agendas, as it sets a foundation to understanding the best approaches to creating more egalitarian relationships within a society. Development and globalization has changed the way in which people think about gender and gender relations. Development paradigms that influence the global gender and development framework have changed over time, and they're influenced by a number of different forces, including aid agency practices, donor fashions, think tanks, private sector norms, and sometimes academic research. Some argue that by the end of the 21st century, all approaches to development will involve some type of focus on women and gender. However, this wasn't always the case. Until the early 1970s, development policies were directed at women only in the context of their roles as wives and mothers, with a focus on mother and child health and reducing fertility. This was known as the welfare approach. It was assumed that the benefits of various macroeconomic strategies for growth would automatically trickle down, and that poor women would benefit as the economic position of their husbands or other male relatives improved. The rise of the women's movement in Western Europe and North America led to a number of critiques of the welfare approach. And in 1975, the UN's International Year for the Woman and the International Women's Decade, which was between 1976 and 1985, led to the establishment of women's ministries in many countries and the institutionalization of women in development policies. These policies aimed to integrate women into the economic development of nations by focusing on income generation projects for women. However, the approach failed to address the complexities of women's unique experiences. The add women and stir approach proved not to be quite enough. The women in development approach was overwhelmingly dominated by white women from developed nations, and the goal was gender equality. Many women from developing nations rejected this approach and argued that the development model itself lacked the perspective of developing nations. These women saw overcoming poverty and the effects of colonialism as much more important issues for women than equality. Out of this grew a new perspective known as the women and development perspective, which aimed to make the view of developing countries more widely known and influential. But gender dynamics include men, women, and those who are beyond the binary. And there are real power dynamics at play in a gendered society. Based on the concept of gender and gender relations, the gender and development approach analyzed how development could reshape power relations. Drawing on feminist political activism, gender and development analysts explicitly saw women as agents of social change, but they knew that issues had to be looked at holistically and that men and women had to be involved in changing these dynamics. Many gender and development analysts began demanding a commitment to change in the structures of power in national and international agencies through what was known as gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming attempts to ensure that women's, as well as men's, concerns and experiences are integral to the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of all projects so that gender inequality is not perpetuating. It also helps overcome many of the problems of male backlash against women when women only projects are successful. The term gender mainstreaming came into widespread use with the adoption of the Platform for Action at the 1995 UN Fourth World Conference on Women held in Beijing, China. The conference was also important because it was the beginning of dialogue related to women's rights as human rights. The human rights approach has become dominant in the last 2 decades. It underlies the Sustainable Development Goals and it considers social justice for all as well as economic development. An aspect of this has been a surge in young feminists as development sectors become more interested in young people as a result of peak youth populations in developing nations. Thus, there's been a vibrant fourth wave of feminism, often focusing on issues such as sexual violence, pioneering online forms of collective action, and feminist ways of working that reject hierarchy and domination, as well as the emergence of young women activists mobilizing in the world in response to the current onslaught of women's rights. But what about globalization? Globalization has impacted gender relations in complex and even contradictory ways. The World Bank has argued that aspects of globalization, such as trade openness and the spread of information and communication technologies, have increased women's access to economic opportunities and, in some cases, increased their wages. In information and communication technology enabled sectors, physical strength is no longer a hiring determinant, and cognitive skills gain in importance. Thus, in many cases, female labor becomes more valued in the workplace. The World Bank also argues that as gender inequality becomes an impediment to international competition, globalization applies peer pressure for countries to ratify treaties against discrimination, and media exposure and consumer demands for better treatment for workers pushes businesses towards fairer wages and better working conditions for women. In addition, the World Bank suggests that economic empowerment reinforces changes in the lives of women by influencing time allocation and decision-making power within households. Public policies aimed at closing gender gaps are therefore necessary for countries to fully capitalize on the potential of globalization as a force for development. In contrast, others have a more pessimistic view of the relationship between globalization and gender. Some scholars have argued that neoliberal policies that are part of a globalized society can translate into governments that are unwilling to assert the rights of their workers, where to do so would discourage investment. Consequences such as social exclusion, unemployment, low paid employment, and weakening of trade union organizations all have gendered dimensions. According to the preliminary report submitted to the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, economic systems which value profits often do so at the expense of female labor. In addition, some scholars have argued that as labor is outsourced to developing nations, women are seen, and hence favored, as a passive, compliant workforce that will accept low wages without demanding labor and human rights. The traditional sexual division of labor has been furthered through the addition of new locations and new forms of work, especially in the service industry, tourism, work in free trade, and export processing zones. What remains constant is the low economic value accorded to work performed primarily by women in conditions of exploitation, no job security, and violations of human rights. The last occur both directly through prohibitions on labor organization and indirectly through further abuses where women have claimed rights such as to organize or be free of sexual harassment. Finally, we know that many people have been critical of the structural adjustment lending programs, where conditions require governments to cut welfare services. These services often serve women at higher rates than men. Keeping this in mind, consider the following story, captured by Jennifer Rothschild in Priti Shritha, from a woman living in rural Nepal. My name is Sabita Sunawar. I think I am 29. In my childhood, I wanted to study and to be a great person, but then my marriage happened. After marriage, we need go to my husband's house, and he didn't allow me to study. After giving birth to my children, my aim also got lost. I studied up to class 5. My school was nearly 2 hours walk from home. Early morning, we used to work at home and come to school and study. When I passed from class 5 to class 6, people came to ask for my hand, and my family accepted one marriage proposal. I left school. I got married at age 15 or 16. He, my husband, is 5 years older than me. He used to do farming. I said it's worthless to do such things, and he went for foreign employment. Now I wake up early in the morning, release goats, and feed the hens and pigs. I wake up at 4:30, 5 a.m. usually, cook food, feed kids to send them to school. Then I clean the dishes, clean the rooms, and prepare the food and drink. In this way my day goes on. I can't sit freely for a single minute. I wish to do a lot in life, but what to do? Imagination doesn't work. I have 2 sons. The younger one was born at home. I went by myself alone for the medical checkup. My husband was in Malaysia for foreign employment. It's been only 5 months. He went just some months ago. The researchers asked the woman, "Did he send you money?" And she replied, "No, he didn't after he went." "How do you earn your livelihood?" the researchers asked. "Just doing here and there, getting busy in the shop and help in education of son, not much. There's also goats and pigs." The researchers asked, "There are some types of training provided in the village. Did you attend any?" "Yes," said the woman, "I did. Financial management with the organization named XXX. I was issued a loan from that organization, but later I left it when I couldn't mobilize the money. I had to pay interest on it. I had borrowed from that organization and I couldn't pay it back on time. Yes, there is suffering. What to expect more than this? I just want to earn more money and live happily. We couldn't study at our time, so I wish my children get their better study and move them in the right path."